Hi everyone, and welcome to week 5. We are now finally halfway through the term and have gone through a lot of basics along the way. For this week, we are going to learn how to complete a picture with some simple black and white values. And as the title suggests, we will first thumbnail out our composition in order to make sure we have a setup that we like. We're also going to be learning how to group our values in order to simplify and plan out an efficient way of completing our picture. For the following demonstrations, I use my graphite pencils, just like the previous week, in order to render out my still life. I also use some gray markers in order to do some quick thumbnailing, and I highly recommend using those tools as they will give you the most amount of gradation control and quick value layout as we do our thumbnails. Of course, I will leave it up to you if you want to use pens for your traditional medium of choice, especially if that's something you want to explore in this class. With that said, let's get started by choosing a setup to draw from. Chapter 1, Value Thumbnails. Alright guys, so here I have a set of thumbnails that I've already drawn out, and I highly recommend using a ruler for these just to keep them neat and to make sure that your measurements are where you want them to be. So here I have them at 3 inches by 2 inches. You can use some metric systems as well. But this is a good size to work in, about a business card size. I want to make sure that you guys aren't drawing too small. So like this one over here to the right, it's the size of a postage stamp. While, doing thumbnails like this for yourself is pretty good. For the assignment at least, I want you guys to make them about this large because we're going to do some values on them. And doing it this small will just make it a little bit harder to see. I also don't want to see thumbnails that are too large where it's about half the page. So keeping it at about 2 to 3 inches or 5 to 8 centimeters is a good size to work in. Now, besides the actual measurements, what I'm really focused on is the use of the ratios. Now, the reason for that is because as you see here, so what I have here is already pre-planned and measured out my final image. So on this 8.5 by 11 sheet, I've measured out the border. So from the top to bottom, it is basically 18 centimeters by 27 centimeters. And that matches perfectly with this 2 by 3 ratio. So measurements are important, but it's mainly about the ratio. That way, whatever we're planning out compositionally will match up with our final image. So whatever measuring system that you're using, whether you're using centimeters, inches, whatever, you just want to make sure that you're getting the ratios the same so it matches up with your final. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start these thumbnails, and I'm going to have the image that I'm looking at to the left. So when starting this out, we're pretty much going to do the same steps as we've done in weeks 2 and 3. Just roughing out the shapes and then fleshing out some of the forms, keeping things very simple. Here I'm going to start off with the line that separates the background from the ground plane while I block in my simple shapes. Now I'm going to start speeding up some sections of this video since a lot of these lessons are repeated from earlier weeks, because I mainly want to talk about getting to simplifying the values and how we can plan those out. Once you've gotten your main line work in for your thumbnail, which will take about a few minutes, we're going to start separating the light and shadow. Alright, so here I'm just trying to find a suitable marker to use. And with a simple black and white image like this, we're just going to use 2 values to block in this thumbnail. So just doing a little swatch, we are going to use the white of the paper and a darker marker that we can use for the shadow. So here I've chosen a warm gray 8. That way it's not too dark, but dark enough that it's definitely going to read as a shadow. So we got our light of the paper to the shadow. So once I got what I've planned out to use, we're going to start blocking in all the shadows. Now I know in the previous week we've learned about all the different sections of the shadows and light, such as the reflected light, but we're going to ignore all that in this thumbnail, and what we're going to be doing is grouping our values. So you're going to hear this term a lot when you start taking a painting class, or even any kind of design course that deals with some kind of rendering. So we are learning how to mask our shapes with the values and group what's important. So just basically finding the cast shadows, the form shadows, and the core shadows, and then just basically simplifying them down into this warm gray 8. Now this value doesn't reflect the actual final value that we're going to use for the rendering. Again, we're just trying to find the impression on how this will read as a whole image. So separating the darks and lights like this in a thumbnail is going to help us look at our overall design and make adjustments if we need to in the future. So this is just the first one, so it's a bit of a warm-up, and we're going to do the same thing with the second. Okay, so for this second image, I've chosen to reframe it and recrop it a little bit, just so I can get a composition that I feel is a little bit nicer. There's a lot of empty space around the still life, and I just want to get the shadows grouped up more within the center. Again, these are lessons from week 2 and 3, where you're taking your artistic license, and even just a simple crop of your frame will, can make a better design for your image. From here, I'm basically going to take the same values that are used for the first image and group my shadows the same way, basically. Going back to that warm gray 8, I find that I can see the massing a little bit easier. You can use a completely black marker or a Sharpie for this when we're just using the extreme darkness of a thumbnail. Definitely take your time just to make sure you're getting the correct spots and the correct shapes of the shadows. And just like the previous assignments, you have the option to do this from observation, which I highly recommend, especially if that's something you really want to practice. But however, for my demo, I'm just looking at the image that I took on my computer screen while doing this traditionally. So there are little sections in here that I'm being a little bit more careful about, making sure there aren't too many tangents. So up here, I know that the shadow is a little bit further out, but what I'm going to do is edit it just a tiny bit so that shadow is peeking in that corner. It's not 100% exact, but it's close enough where it's going to help my composition. Now this does take practice and a little bit of trial and error to figure out where you can get away with putting certain shadows and what to leave out. But that will come with time and just practicing this a little bit more and just learning how to keep your shadows simple and how to balance your composition. For this third still life, there is a new challenge involved, because we have to deal with a third value. So with this still life, as you see here, it has this wooden texture and color to it. We're going to ignore the texture, but we do have to take the color into consideration. So from here, I am planning out 3 values for my swatch when we do these, when we block in the values for the thumbnail. For the main shadow, I'm just going to use the same thing I did for my previous 2, which is the warm gray 8. And for the halfway in between wooden value, I'm basically just going to use a warm gray 4 and white of the paper for blocking in the lights. So when you have these 3 blocked in, it's going to make it a lot easier to just mask in the values while keeping track of the natural color of your still life objects. So naturally, I'm going to start blocking this in and thinking about how I want this image to be composed. So some of my thought process on this one, I'm again recropping this image because I like the shapes that I see towards the center of these objects. As you saw there, I made a little error where I had a tangent with the corner of that cube. So I just pushed it out a little more, closer to the actual proportion. And that way I don't run into that weird tangent, kind of flattens out my image. That and the fact that the cube was just way off in my drawing. Okay, so now that I got my lines and shapes blocked in, I'm going to use that middle value to just quickly block in the local color of the wood. The marker I have are warm markers, and they have that sort of a brown or yellow tint to them. However, if you have the neutral gray, this will work just as fine. I'm not trying to color this. We're just trying to get the general value. From here, I'm basically just covering the mass of the entire object and not worrying too much about the shadows just yet. From here, just like the previous 2 still lifes, I can now mask in all the shadows, both on the form of the object, both on the object themselves, and the cast shadows created on the ground plane. Now you don't have to use markers. You can use graphite for these thumbnails if you don't have the markers or you prefer to just practice your other traditional mediums. You're also welcome to use some of the pens, and then you're going to have to use some of the swatches like you learned from the previous week, keeping your lines separated when the values are a little bit lighter. Definitely using the hatching method with the pens is going to be the most difficult. Markers are the easiest on the other end of the spectrum, and then I would say graphite will be somewhere in between. For those of you wanting to do this digitally, I'll show it during the Q&A for those that want to see a little bit more. But I've seen that a lot of the students in here want to do more of the traditional mediums, as you can get a large amount of control. But the technique's pretty much the same. Even with the digital medium, you can just make some swatches and put the certain values on top of your drawing. If you ever have trouble separating the values or the shadows from the actual color of the objects themselves, one tip I have is to squint your eyes and to see if that impression is reading in terms of just keeping it simple and grouping your values. So straight away I'm going to speed this section up as well. And it's very similar to the last one where it's the wooden still lifes. So I'm going to make sure I'm using the 3-value system that I have above. And from here I want to make the focal point basically this top sphere that's on the cube. One thing I like about it is I don't really have to edit much. The still life itself has a nice natural focal point because there's a strong highlight on that sphere which I would want to capture, especially when I get into the finishing details, if I were to take this one to finish. Now for some of you that have been setting up your own still lifes, which is really awesome, it's definitely a lot nicer that you can pretty much just move things around and compose based on where you're sitting. So that way you don't have to edit your drawing at all. You can just set up a nice composition with your still life, taking your time before you even start to draw. Of course, if you're doing a landscape, you can't move things around. You're not going to move around a tree, a building, etc. So that's where you have to really edit your image to make a better design. Is you got to be willing to move a tree here and there. But of course, doing a landscape versus a still life is a lot more difficult because there's just so much more going on. Now there are different levels, skill levels in this class. So, go with what works best for you, where it's not going to be too hard, but you want to make sure you're still learning. So there is a fine balance of, the kind of subject you want to really capture. But definitely don't pick something that's too easy where, it's too much of a cakewalk and you're not really learning anything. However, even for my skill level, with these still lifes, there's always something to learn from them. For this last set, I'm going to go ahead and revisit these older still lifes that are a bit more challenging. So they have more materials, but I'm still going to use the same 3-value system in order to tackle these. Now the reason for that is even though there are different values, multiple values and because of the different materials, such as the glass, the metal, and the fruit, we still need to be able to simplify these. Besides the different materials, there's also different colors in this still life, but we are trying to translate it in black and white. So this is definitely good practice, whether you're drawing this from life or even just a photograph. There's a lot of skills that you'll be learning by being able to make a judgment call on what value you're looking at. So here I've just made the swatch again, just to kind of remind myself what I need to group when I start arranging and massing my lights and darks. So for something like this, I recommend starting with a medium color, or value I should say. Now, the reason for that is just like the wooden still lifes, the wooden forms, all of these objects already have a certain value that's darker than the white background. So immediately knowing that the colors are darker than the white, we can just mass it in with this 40% gray. So all the shadows, all the objects, I am making sure I can just fill them in. There is a small section here that I kind of left white with the paper, only because the glass is, see-through. So for now, I'm just going to leave it blank. From there, using the darker marker now I'm going to judge based on the relationships of the values in the still life to make a call whether this should be in the 40% gray or just mass it into the darker value. I know you can't see this here, but what I'm constantly doing is squinting my eyes, and this kind of helps me observe the values a little bit grouped together and not worrying about details. So to make it easier for myself, I've gone ahead and darkened the shadows first, knowing that it's going to be darker than the objects and obviously the paper. From here, I'm kind of working my way in, and in this glass bottle, notice how the darks in there are even darker than the shadow. So it's safe to say that we can group it with the same value. Looking at the metal vase, there's some darks in there as well. So I'm squinting my eyes so I don't get distracted by the details. And just trying to look for blocks of shapes in terms of either a shadow or just like the darker values that make up certain shapes. So I'm leaving room for that highlight, which I've drawn a circle with. So one thing I could have done differently is left it white with the paper for that highlight, but I did mass it in really quickly with that 40% gray. So I will be going a little bit more careful in this glass little bottle. It has the most amount of variety and light values in there. But other than that, that's pretty much finished in terms of just grouping the areas here. You could always go back in. So I noticed I missed this little triangular pitch shadow in there, and it does help separate that fruit from that vase. Since this is a more complex still life, and if you're doing something like this, make sure you just double check your values and to be sure that you're not using more than 3. For this final thumbnail that I'll be demoing, I've picked something that has a bit of a challenge in here, mainly because of that white bottle that blends in with the background and the ground plane, since they're all pretty much white with some values in between. So starting off, I'm making sure that that's also my focal point because I'm liking the kind of highlights that are on that bottle. So I don't really have to do too much recropping here. Again, I feel like the photo has a pretty natural focal point. Now I will be doing something a little bit differently towards the end of this thumbnail, just sort of to introduce what we're going to be doing next week, and a little hint on if you were to edit certain aspects of value, how you would kind of go about it or think about it, if you need to make something read a little bit clearer. But straight off the bat, I've decided to start with the darker values here to mark in the shadows. So a little bit differently than the previous thumbnail where I just kind of went with the 40% gray and marked in all the objects first. But here I just decided to do the shadows, mainly because I was just feeling confident and I wanted to see um, the darkest darks and the lightest patterns, just like the first two thumbnails. Because technically you can actually do these exercises with just two values, and that's how a lot of artists and illustrators really think about when composing an image, keeping it just two values. And three is, still very challenging as well. So for the homework week, I want to make sure you guys are only sticking to three values for now at the most when doing these thumbnails. So for that green cylinder, I decided to just block it in dark because it's definitely darker than the wooden blocks. So I've grouped it in with the darker value. Same thing with that sort of a dark brown bottle. Just kind of grouping it all together. Not worried about like all the white text that's on there. We're trying to get the general values of the mass and shape of the object. All right, so this is where I'm going to take a bit of an artistic license because I'm limited to three values. If I had a 10 or 20%, this would be a little bit easier, but I'm really sticking to my rules here. So the white bottle is almost blending in with the background, but if I were to do this in the final, I want to make sure they have enough contrast in there in order to be clear, especially because it's my focal point. I want to edit this a little bit, just like week 2. You don't have to do this week, but this is just a little preview of what you would do in order to just make your focal point pop out. So with this 40% gray, I've decided to group the background a little bit into that middle value. That way it kind of blends in with the green bottle and it becomes less of a focal point. But now the white bottle truly stands out. Again, you don't have to do this, but this is sort of a thought process if you were to do, let's say, a painting and you need something to be a little bit clearer, mainly based on your focal point. But yeah, we're going to do more of that next week when we change up the values even on just like one still life. But for this one, try different difficulties of the subjects. So I've gone from just plain black and white to some colored objects and then still lifes with different materials. So fill up a page of thumbnails. And after that, we're ready to start the final drawing. Chapter 2, Line Drawing and Assigning Values. Now that we've got our thumbnails finished and simplified our values by figuring out the separation of light and shadow, we can now see the abstract design that our composition has. From here, we're going to pick our favorite thumbnail to take to finish. I've gone ahead and chosen the second one I did, mainly because I like the abstract pattern that the shadow is creating. I also wanted to keep the rendering demonstration as simple as I could, as it's similar enough to our week 4 demonstration with matte surface objects. Like I mentioned earlier, I've marked out and measured the border for my final image. You're welcome to draw using the whole page or even a larger sheet of paper like I have here in the back. Just remember to mark it off with the proper ratios as your thumbnails in order to keep track of your placement of objects and overall composition. So checking my thumbnail, I want to make sure I get the proper placement as I draw this larger. I am, however, going to still be looking at the still life image off screen as you see posted up here on the left. From here, it's really up to you where you want to start the larger drawing. My suggestion would be to start with the largest shapes first and work your way to the smaller ones. You can also work from front to back, like I've done here by starting off with the circle, since it's the most front object in my setup. Just remember to judge your placement based on the frame that you laid out on your thumbnail. And if you're still in doubt on what shapes to put down first or what to do next, just block in what you feel is the easiest at the moment. It's better to place something down first and make the necessary adjustments afterwards. So even though it's off screen, I'm also checking back at my still life setup just to make sure I adjust any placement issues I might have made in the initial thumbnail sketch. There's still plenty of room to make any necessary changes on the final. So just remember to draw as light as you can, and I'm actually drawing slightly darker than I would normally do for a lay-in, just so it would show up in this demo. However, this is still light enough that I can easily erase this without any noticeable marks for when I start to shade. And for any of you wondering, I'm currently using a 2B pencil. The reason is I like to use the relatively softer pencils for lay-ins, just so it's easier for me to have a lighter touch and not having to press down too hard on the paper. So depending on the type of paper you have, it can be either really fragile or take a lot of abuse from a pencil or an eraser. So here I'm using very inexpensive paper. This is just the copy paper. It's 20 pounds, and basically it's fairly fragile, so I have to make sure I don't press too hard. There are more expensive papers out there, of course, leading to things like vellum, which you can use for an assignment like this. Generally, with a thicker paper, you can, tend to rough it up a little bit more and make a lot of adjustments necessary. So here I've gone ahead and sped up the demonstration. As you can see, I'm kind of just going back and forth, checking my placement, making sure I'm following through when drawing my ellipses, and just seeing what kind of shapes I can block in lightly in order to help me with the shading. Okay, so now that I've got my major shapes, both form and shadows, I'm going to start reassessing my line quality so I can go back in here and darken up some of the necessary lines. So just like the lessons you've learned from week 3, what I'm trying to do is take care of any overlaps and be a little bit more accurate with my shapes and forms. Now there are going to be sections in this still life where I will be lightening some of those lines. The reason is I want to get the effect of light to show through even with the line work. So again, even though it's a little bit darker now, the touch is still fairly soft and it's easy for me to erase these areas. One recommendation I have for the shadows is to not darken them too much because we're going to create a bit of a blur on them as the edges get softer. So from here, I'm just kind of touching it up a little bit, making sure I don't have any noticeable tangents in my composition. So this shadow up here by the cone is a lot sharper than the other one, so I can darken that just a tiny bit. And then from here, what I would recommend is to either take a good scan or a photo, like I'm doing here with my phone, of your line work. And once you've done that, this is where we're going to start assigning those values. So the reason I want you guys to take a photo is that way you can turn in the line work and the rendering separately. Alright, so what we need to do now, before just trying to render everything out, we're going to need to plan things out and bring out our swatches again. We need to think about our value range and plan out an efficient approach to how we're going to render this. It's a good idea to number off your values, just like I'm doing here. So maybe starting off with a 20, 40%, 60, 80, and 100. From here, it's just like our gray markers. Now we have a way to keep track of which values go where. Again, instead of just blindly rendering away, we want to look at our subject and start to map out where these general values are going to be at. Next, I'm actually going to lightly write down the values on my drawing, starting with my darkest darks. I will assign an 80% in this core shadow and about an 80 for these cast shadows, at least in the darkest areas. So as it fades out, it's going to get into the 70% range. This part's a core shadow, so it's also going to be an 80. And it's going to go into a reflected light, so it's going to get a little bit lighter as it goes across the cone. Now this is probably the trickiest part here on this cube because it's in the light, but it's receiving less light and has a bit of a value. So knowing that it's not in a complete shadow, I at least want to make sure it's lighter than 50. So for now I'm going to put a 40% on it just to make sure that part reads. From there, I pretty much blocked in where all my shadows are. And now I'm going to go into the halftone and the other areas in the light. I've noticed in the still life that the part on the cylinder is the lightest. So I'm going to assign it to about 10 to 20, as well as the part on the cone. Now from here, I'm just kind of taking a look at some areas I might have missed, such as this reflected light area in the sphere, which can be probably a 60% for now. So also looking at the ground plane where these objects are sitting at, they need to have a value because it's not a complete highlight. So it needs to be darker than just a plain 0. So here for now, I've put a 20 to 30%, and that assures that it's also darker than that 40. Now, when you assign all these value numbers, just remember that we're not trying to be super perfect right now. We're just trying to generalize. So just like we did in our thumbnails where we simplified the light and shadow, we want to get the general values in this still life so that way we can plug those values in really quickly. And then towards the end, when we start getting to more of the fine sort of areas, we can make adjustments as we go on. So before we render, just make sure you take your time on this step so you can get the proper values mapped out. Chapter 3, final rendering. To start us off, I'm actually going to look at my value thumbnail and really take note of my separation of light to dark. So even though I'm not going to go straight into the 80%, I'm going to at least start off with a light shade covering all the tones in the dark areas. So of course I'm going to need to erase some of the writing I've done just so I can see the even tone that I'm putting in. And for reference, I'm using a 4B pencil. That way it's soft enough that the way I'm holding my pencil is so light, it's still making a decent mark. So just like starting those value gradients, I'm just trying to get a nice even tone to get me started. Now this one is in real time, of course, but I promise you, you're not going to have to watch the entire rendering in real time. I want to make sure you guys don't have to fall asleep. So there are several sections in this video that are sped up. Now one thing I recommend is to start from the top left and working your way to the bottom right if you're right-handed. That way you don't get a lot of the graphite smearing on the bottom of your hand. I will later be putting a sheet of paper, a clean sheet of paper under my palm. That way when I do start getting into more of the rendering, I'll make sure that my drawing stays clean as well as my hand. Because for those of you that know that, for those of you that have done quite a bit of shading with pencils, that it can be pretty messy. So I've gone ahead and sped up this section obviously, and again just an even flat tone just to separate where all my shadows are in order to get me started. Definitely keep a kneaded eraser with you handy, just to pick up the graphite, not really scrubbing too hard. So I've put this back into real time because I just want to make a few notes here. Now looking at my thumbnail value, you can see how it's basically the same impression, where I just blocked in all the shadows to separate what's light and dark. And from here, it's really easy to go in there to really get the subtle differences in between based on the actual still life. And this is just to double check that we have our composition working true. From here, this is where a little scrap piece of paper will come in handy, because now I'm really starting to get into the majority of the rendering. So in this part, I'm really just going to block in this part of the cube, because I noticed that it's probably the most trickiest. It's somewhere in between the kind of halftone and getting to in the shadow side. Just like I assigned it earlier, I'm going to get it down to that 40% as close as I can, and then I'll just adjust it later. So from here, I got the 40% on that cube, and it's pretty close. But now I'm feeling pretty confident to go to the 80%, and this is where I'm going to start to get the majority of my core shadows and some of my darkest darks. Just like last week, make sure you take your time on the rounded forms, especially because they have that subtle gradient. So I'm working my way from the core shadow, and then as I go towards the reflected light, I start to make a lighter touch as I go towards the edge. I'm also trying to be careful about getting the roundness of my strokes. And mind you, I'm still using the 4B pencil, and for blocking in the majority of the shadows, even if I only get it to about the 60 or 70% gray, it's going to get me far enough before I have to switch pencils. So a quick note here, I'm going to zoom in really quickly, is how to handle some of these edges. So you want to make sure you have a nice sharp pencil, and you want to rotate your page as much as you can to really get comfortable and get the proper direction of your shading stroke. Because in the end, we're trying to get rid of the line work and just try to have tones read. So notice that I have my pencil at a fairly extreme angle. That ensures that I'm not pressing too hard, but I'm still getting a fine point on the tip. That way I can maximize the amount of graphite that I can put into the paper. And then from here, you basically just keep going. Put on some good music and block in your shadows. Especially for these large areas where there's a lot going on, there's a lot of gradient in that shadow. I'm trying my best to sneak up on that area and make sure I go about it as light as I can, really just trying to build it up slowly. Basically just like the gradient exercise we did in week 4. Here I've put it back into real time because I'm starting to get into my halftones now. So unlike my shadows, I really have to get a little bit slower with this section. So I moved on to a 2B again, just to get some of these halftone gradients, because the 4B was getting a little bit too dark. Taking a look at my photo, I noticed there's a bit of a sort of a highlight area here. So I'm trying to sneak up on it and going slow and smooth as I can. So I'm definitely going back and forth to my darker, softer pencils, whenever I need to adjust my shadows accordingly. Because once I put in those halftones, I notice that my shadows can then go darker. So looking at this 40% that I put down on the cube, I can see how I can go a little bit darker now on the top. So looking at the photograph, you can see that there's a bit of reflected light bouncing from the ground into the bottom of the cube. So this is where I can start to get a little bit more intricate with my shading. So looking at each surface, not just the round ones, but even these flat areas of the cube, how much of a difference of a gradient there is on its way down. And then I know it's hard to see on this cylinder, but there is a gradient there. So the edges have a bit more of a tonal value as it works its way to the center, where it's creating a bit of a highlight. So I want to make sure I get that gradient to read across to make this look round. And I might have to even push it more than what the photograph is showing me. Just like what some of you guys have been doing for weeks 2 and 3, I recommend also drawing from observation. So have a setup in front of you in real life, and you can really see a lot more tones. And it's a great way to just really train yourself. So from there, I'm basically just gonna kind of work my way back and forth into the different sections of shadows. But one thing, after looking at my gradient one more time, I can see that I can still push my shadows way darker. But definitely start with this approach where you're going about this light and working your way through. Now what I'm looking for now are my darkest darks. So looking at the still life, there's a section in the corner of the cone, the center of the cube and sphere, and underneath some of these forms. So these 4 sections are basically where I need to put my darkest darks. This is where I'm now using a 6B and at times even an 8B pencil. And you'll notice how much slower I'm working now. Really trying to work on my edges. Punching my darks as far as they can go, but making sure they're in those little sections. So when I squint my eyes, I can see that the core shadows can go a bit darker now as I relate it to the pit shadows underneath. And at least for my goal, what I'm trying to do is get rid of the line work and just have the tone showing. And with these darker tones, I'm starting to get close to sort of the finishing values that I'd like. But I'm still trying my best to be a little bit careful and not press down too much on the paper. Now that I got my darkest darks laid out for the majority of the shadows, I need to make sure I get rid of the rest of the white areas of the paper. So I assigned the 20 to 30% on this section. So I want to make sure I block in that whole area, as well as the sphere and the cylinder, which I marked at about the 20% area for the halftone. I've gone ahead and switched back to my 2B pencil just so I can get the rest of the graphite in here pretty much without too much stress. I'm also working my way back into some of the line work and making it lighter as I go across. Because the way that edge of the cone is reading is just based on the surface that the objects are on being a little bit darker. So I just really working my way through. That's why I sped this section up. It's really just a flat, even value of a 20% gray. Okay, so from here, when you have the rest of your page blocked in, mostly with the major values that we've planned out, I definitely recommend taking a huge long break and just to step away from your page. Because even for me, even though I've been rendering now for about 30 minutes on this project, I need to make sure that I refresh my eyes and not get too caught up on all the little details or distractions that might be in this image. But from here, it's pretty much a home stretch. You just want to keep taking your time and just work your way through, just like all the forms we did for week 4. Now with this demonstration, it's basically sort of the simplest scenario where it's a still life that's also just black and white values. I'm not trying to deal with any color or any crazy materials. So if you were to do the ones with the wooden blocks, that's definitely a step up from what I'm doing here. You're going to have to deal with a little bit more texture in your the way you're going to render it out. And above that would also be the other still lifes where there's different materials and different color. So when you get to things like glass, liquid, or metal, it's definitely going to act a little bit differently than a matte surface. While it's pretty difficult to go through each different material for this week, I will, bring it up during the Q&A for those that are having a little bit of issues on them. But the same techniques will apply. So basically just assigning values, seeing where the certain edges are different against one another. And again, just trying to keep things simple. You're basically working with gradients or breaks up of light and shadows that are a little bit more harsh, just like the swatches. So general rule of thumb, if you have a curved surface, you'll have a gradient. So when things are a little bit flatter, you're definitely going to have a more even tone. Now when things are metallic, there's a lot more reflectivity in them. So you're going to get a lot of highlights in there. You're going to get a warmer glow, or brighter glow, I should say. And that might make the reflective light pretty bright on, versus a general matte surface. And the thing about rendering like this, especially with graphite, again, just continue to take your time. That way you don't have to erase or make something brighter. And the thing about rendering, especially with graphite and especially ink, you want to make sure you just take your time and plan accordingly. It might seem slow at first, but it's actually going to be really efficient, and you're going to knock out the more important values straight on in the beginning. Because one thing you don't want to do is have to erase too much. Because if you start erasing on your gradients, it can destroy some parts of the graphite or even smear it. Now again, there are certain types of paper that do a lot better with overuse or on the surface. So I recommend getting a drawing paper that might be a little bit thicker. Or if you have an art store near you, it wouldn't hurt to get a few pages of vellum. There's a few recommendations I have. There's plenty out there, but we can talk about that perhaps during a Q&A. But in terms of rendering with graphite, you can't really go wrong with any sort of paper. If you use pen, however, the best kind of paper to use for hatching would be something that's really smooth. If you have something that's porous or that has a bit of texture, those are better for mediums like charcoal or chalk. But when you're dealing with a lot of pen, you usually want to get something called hot press. And that's a flattened out sheet of paper, usually fairly thick, but nice and smooth, somewhat glossy, and that holds ink really well, ensuring that you get nice smooth lines when you do some hatching. Okay, so this one's pretty much done for the demonstration, and I worked on it for about 50 minutes total. So I would recommend spending at least an hour on the rendering alone. So that's not including the line work and even, the initial thumbnails. Now again, this is the more basic setup. So if you have something a little bit more difficult, I expect you guys to, spend a little bit more time and just ensuring that you can push yourself to the limit in terms of what you can do for rendering. And I highly recommend getting started on this as early as you can during the week. That way you can have as many breaks as you need to in order to get fresh eyes away from your work. Because, when you have some time away from your own artwork, it's easier to kind of see the mistakes you might have done or what other adjustments you need in order to get it finished. Other than that, this concludes this week's lectures and demonstrations. So I hope you guys learned something, and hopefully you guys have fun finishing out your own rendering. Alright everyone, so your homework for week 5 is to do 6 value thumbnails, and that is minimum. So if you want to do more, you are welcome to do so. And just remember to please include the reference sheet so I know what you guys are drawing from and assigning your values. Now for the value thumbnails, you can use marker like I did, or you just want to practice more of the pencils. You can use graphite just like you would with the normal swatches, and you could render that way for your thumbnails. And extra credit, if you want to try some hatching on your thumbnails, you can do so as well. And then when you go to your final rendering, the smallest size I recommend is 6 by 8 inches or 15 centimeters by 20 centimeters. And the largest being 11 by 14 or 28 by 36 centimeters. Now you could vary the length and width in between these minimum and maximum. Just make sure it's about the same ratio as your thumbnails. That way you ensure that you have the same composition. Now the easiest medium to do this in will be graphite for sure, because you'll have the most amount of control, just like you saw in my demonstration. If you want to do a second final rendering, you can use a pen. Use your favorite one that you like the most, and you could do some hatching to finish out your drawing. And some extra credit, you can also practice some of this digitally, and if you have any questions on how to approach that, we can do so during the Q&A. But other than that, I highly recommend doing these traditionally first and foremost. That way you have the most amount of control and stick to the basics for now. Other than that, I hope you guys have fun this week, and looking forward to seeing what you guys finish up.